In the mid-14th century, Europe stood at a fragile crossroads. The medieval world had known its share of famines, wars, and revolts. Yet nothing had prepared it for the silent storm approaching from beyond the horizon. The continent buzzed with renewed trade, agricultural recovery after the Great Famine, and a population that had nearly doubled over 2 centuries. Markets were crowded, cathedrals soared skyward, and European rulers, from London to Florence, believed destiny favored them, but destiny had other plans. Our story begins in the bustling Mediterranean trade networks, a web of caravans, ships, merchants, and sailors connecting Europe to the Near East. It was through these routes that unseen passengers traveled, the fleas, clinging to rats, carrying a deadly bacterium unknown to medieval physicians, Yersinia pestis. The people of the 1340s had no concept of microbes, contagion, or transmission. Illnesses were explained by celestial omens, divine wrath, foul air, or malign spirits. This ignorance created the perfect environment for catastrophe. Narrator's tone drops. In the year of our Lord, 1346. Whispers began to circulate along the trade roads. A mysterious sickness in the east. Entire villages silent, caravans missing, and rumors that even the mighty Khan of the Mongols could not escape death's hand. In distant Asia, the plague was already blazing through crowded cities of the Silk Road, leaving emptiness where life once thrived. This devastation was a warning, but Europe never heard it. Meanwhile, in cities like Genoa, Venice, and Marseille, merchants prepared for yet another prosperous trading season. Goods were loaded, sailors boarded ships, and rats scurried over wooden planks and ropes. Unnoticed, the medieval world was about to collide with one of the deadliest biological disasters in human history. But for now, Europe smiled under a deceptively peaceful sky. Little did they know, the shadow had already begun its march. The first decisive blow of the Black Death's arrival in Europe came not through natural spread, but through war. The Crimean port city of Caffa, controlled by Genoese merchants, stood at the crossroads of the Mediterranean and the Asian steppe. It was here, in 1346, that East met West in the most horrifying way imaginable. The Mongol Golden Horde, under Johnny Beg Khan, had laid siege to Caffa after a political dispute with the Genoese. But something unexpected happened in the Mongol camps. A mysterious sickness erupted, swelling buboes, fever, delirium, and sudden collapse. Soldiers died by the thousands. Panic spread faster than arrows. Chroniclers recorded, no weapon was as cruel as this new death. As Mongol forces weakened, they resorted to a desperate and horrifying tactic, one of the earliest recorded instances of biological warfare. According to the notary Gabriel de Mussy, the Mongols loaded the corpses of plague victims onto catapults and hurled them over Caffa's walls. Inside Caffa, the Genoese were horrified as the bodies crashed into the streets, bursting open and releasing the deadly contagion. Fleas jumped from cloth to ground, from rats to humans, igniting a wildfire of infection. When the siege lifted, the Genoese fled aboard ships, desperate to escape death. But they carried death with them. Their vessels sailed across the Mediterranean to Constantinople, Sicily, Genoa, Messina, and Marseille. Everywhere they docked, rats rushed down gangplanks, fleas found new hosts, and the plague spread like sparks in a dry forest. The fall of Caffa was more than the end of a siege. It was the opening of Europe's greatest nightmare. In the autumn of 1347, a fleet of Genoese trading ships approached the harbor of Messina, Sicily. At first glance, nothing seemed unusual. Merchant ships regularly sailed from the Black Sea, carrying spices, furs, silk, and grain. But as the vessels drifted closer, the Sicilian authorities sensed something was terribly wrong. Sailors lay slumped on the decks, some dying, some already dead. Others stumbled ashore with blackened swellings, coughing blood. Their eyes reflected fear, confusion, and a strange acceptance, as if they had already seen the end of their world. Chronicles described the horror. The sailors bore on them a sickness so terrible, no man dared look upon them. The Sicilians panicked. They shouted orders, rang warning bells, and demanded the ships leave immediately. But the damage was already done. As crew members staggered through the port, fleas dropped from their clothing. Rats scurried from the dark hold onto ropes, docks, and warehouses, disappearing into the island's streets. The ships of death continued their voyage, not by choice, but because no port wanted them. They were driven away from Messina, only to seek refuge in Genoa, Venice, Marseille, Pisa, and Tunis. Everywhere they arrived, the same horror repeated: infected bodies, panicked citizens, and a silent invasion of rats. Modern historians believe these ships triggered the first wave of the plague's explosion across Europe. But medieval people had no understanding of vectors. They saw only death following ships, like a curse sent by God. A Venetian chronicler wrote, "In days but a few, sickness spread like fire on dry straw. It leaped from house to house without mercy." Messina was the first European city to feel the full fury of the Black Death. Within weeks, entire families perished. Priests refused to administer last rites. Bells tolled endlessly until there were no more hands to ring them. The sea, once Europe's lifeline, had become the path of devastation. A new enemy had arrived, silent, unseen, unstoppable. After the plague's arrival in Messina, Sicily became the first European battleground in a war it could not comprehend. Word spread quickly through the monasteries' markets and ports: a death has come that no prayer can stop. The disease traveled inland, carried by merchants, pilgrims, and frightened families fleeing infected towns. But flight only hastened the catastrophe. Sicily's villages, tightly packed and dependent on grain stores filled with rats, became perfect breeding grounds. Farmers found their fields abandoned, cattle left to wander, and granaries eerily silent except for the scratching of rodents from Sicily. The plague swept northward into Italy, striking one major city after another. Genoa, the unwilling conduit, the Genoese, once proud masters of Mediterranean trade, now carried a terrible guilt. Their ships had become floating coffins, and as they returned home, the plague followed. Genoa erupted in panic. Crowds stormed through the streets, begging for divine forgiveness. The city gates were sealed too late. Venice, a drowning republic, Venice, the jewel of the Adriatic, was one of the most densely populated cities on Earth. Ships arriving from the east funneled directly into the Grand Canal, and so did the infection. Within weeks, gondoliers, merchants, nobles, and servants collapsed on bridges and in marketplaces. A Venetian chronicler lamented, no distinction was made between patrician and pauper. Death walked freely in our lanes. The government attempted an unprecedented measure: isolation of the sick on nearby islands, the earliest form of quarantine. But the system was overwhelmed long before it could be enforced. Florence, a city of art, meets a city of graves in Florence. The plague erupted with explosive force. The city's wealth, silk, wool, and banking attracted travelers from all corners of Europe. This influx, combined with dense neighborhoods, allowed the plague to burn through the population like wildfire. Among those who witnessed the catastrophe was Giovanni Boccaccio, who later wrote in the Decameron, "Brothers abandoned brothers, parents their children. No human bond remained." Florence lost nearly half its population in mere months. Italy, the center of trade, culture, and learning, was collapsing. Europe looked on in disbelief, not yet realizing that the same fate awaited them. The South had fallen. The plague now turned its gaze westward, as Italy descended into chaos. The plague moved relentlessly northwest, crossing the borders into Provence and southern France. In the spring of 1348, merchants fleeing the burning cities of Italy unknowingly carried the disease across mountain passes and trading routes. The Kingdom of France, already ravaged by the early years of the 100 Years' War, now faced an adversary far deadlier than any English army. Marseille, the gateway of death, Marseille, fell with terrifying speed. Ships arriving from Genoa brought rats swarming through the port warehouses. Fishermen, sailors, and merchants collapsed in days. The city government attempted to flee inland, but the plague followed in their footsteps. A local monk wrote, "Death filled the alleys like smoke." The sick lay on the steps of the church, begging for mercy. Yet no hand dared touch them. Refugees poured north, carrying the infection deeper into France. Avignon, the papal city under siege. Avignon, home of the papal court, became the next major victim. Here, the plague struck with political and spiritual shock. The Pope at the time, Clement VI, was besieged by petitions from terrified citizens. So many corpses accumulated that traditional burial became impossible. The Pope sanctified the Rhone River as holy ground so that bodies could be thrown into it when graveyards overflowed. Chroniclers described a haunting sight. Boats drifted on the river, heavy with corpses, as if the dead themselves sought passage to the next world. Avignon became a city of smoke, as fires were lit day and night to purify the air. A desperate attempt, based on the medieval belief in miasma. Montpellier. Toulouse, Lyon, no city was spared. University towns like Montpellier, known for medical learning, were powerless. Doctors, wearing primitive herbal masks, argued whether the planets had shifted or whether God had abandoned mankind. In Lyon, trade routes to Paris became arteries of death. Markets shut down, churches overflowed, and entire districts were abandoned to rats. France's feudal order, already strained by war, began to collapse. Laborers died in such numbers that fields went untilled. Villages vanished. Nobles fled to castles. The line between peasant and lord dissolved. All were equal before the pestilence. The Kingdom of France was not just suffering, it was breaking, and the plague was now marching toward the greatest crown in Western Europe, England. By late 1348, whispers of Italy's collapse and France's devastation had reached the English coast. Merchants returned with tales too horrific to believe, streets piled with bodies, entire villages deserted, and a sickness that killed faster than fire spread. Yet in England, life continued with uneasy normalcy. Many dismissed the rumors as exaggeration or divine. Punishment limited to sinful lands across the sea, but the English Channel, for centuries, a proud barrier against foreign invasion, could not stop what was coming. Dorset, the first breach in the summer of 1348. A handful of ships docked at Melcombe Regis in Dorset. Some carried cloth, some grain, but all carried the same unseen cargo. Rats scattered onto the docks. Fleas jumped to new hosts. Within days, residents complained of fever and swollen bubes. Within weeks, the first corpses appeared. English chroniclers wrote anxiously, "A cruel pestilence entered our land, brought by merchants of distant shores. Fear spread faster than the plague itself." But it was too late. The disease multiplied silently, preparing its assault on the rest of the kingdom. Bristol, a Port Falls trade, continued. The plague reached Bristol, one of England's busiest harbours. Ships brought spices and wool from France and Flanders, and death. Bristol's narrow lanes and timber houses provided the perfect environment for the plague to explode. Merchants died in their counting rooms. Dockworkers fell at their posts. Parish priests collapsed Commerce, the lifeblood of medieval England, halted. One witness later wrote, "No man had the strength to bury the dead. The living fled, leaving their kin unburied." The king and his court king, Edward III, locked in conflict with France, watched from Windsor with growing dread. Letters reached him daily, describing towns emptied, crops untended, and soldiers dying in their barracks. In one recorded petition, Edward demanded, "What is this sickness that slays so swiftly? Are we punished by God, or poisoned by our enemies?" The royal physicians had no answer. The plague takes aim at London by the winter of 1348. The disease moved along roads, rivers, and trade routes toward the heart of the kingdom, London. The largest and most crowded city in England, the shadow had crossed the sea. Now it prepared to engulf an empire, by early 1349. The plague reached the outskirts of London, a city of nearly 80,000 souls, the largest, most crowded, and most economically vital centre in all of England. If the disease had been a fire in Dorset and Bristol, in London it became a furnace. The city's geography made it uniquely vulnerable. Narrow timber houses leaned over cobblestone streets, casting dark shadows even at midday. Open drains ran along alleys. Animal pens, butcher stalls, and tanners crowded riverside districts. Rats thrived here, living in thousands among the food markets, sewers, warehouses, and homes. London was prepared for thieves, riots, and invading armies, but not for an invisible enemy. The first cases in the city. The initial victims were recorded near the Thames docks, where sailors and merchants mingled. When the first deaths occurred, few grasped the significance. People died often in medieval cities from fevers, injuries, or hunger, but not like this. Within days, entire households collapsed. Parish records show a sudden, terrifying surge of burials. Gravediggers worked through the night. Priests wore soaked cloths over their faces, praying over lines of corpses. A chronicler described, "So many died that pits were dug in the churchyards, and bodies laid therein by the hundreds. None could count them." The great mortality in the capital. By spring, London was drowning in the plague. Markets emptied. Guildhalls shuttered. Those who could flee moved north to the countryside, but many carried the infection with them, spreading the pestilence deeper into England. The city watch ordered taverns and playhouses closed. Bells tolled endlessly. Physicians, proud scholars in long robes, offered contradictory advice. Avoid bad air, burn herbs, pray, bleed the sick, flee the city. Nothing worked. Voices of the living and the dying historians believe London lost up to 60% of its population in a matter of months. For every nobleman who hid in his manor, dozens of workers, artisans, bakers, and servants died abandoned. A survivor recalled, "The streets were silent, not from peace, but from the absence of the living." London, the beating heart of England, was choking. And as the capital fell, the disease surged outward in every direction, like a fire-consuming dry wood. Asterisk, when London collapsed under the weight of the Black Death, the plague did not rest. It turned outward, flowing like a dark tide into the countryside, into the villages, farms, mills, and manors that sustained the kingdom. For many, rural life had always meant relative safety from urban disease. But this enemy respected no boundary, no forest, no river, no estate wall from roads to rivers. The plague's rural pathways in England's countryside was connected by countless roads, market routes, pilgrimage paths, wool caravans, and messengers carrying letters for the crown. These channels became conduits for infection. From London, Bristol, and coastal towns, fleeing refugees scattered across shires, unknowingly sowing death. Wherever they sought shelter, villages that had thrived for generations suddenly found themselves confronted with a sickness they could neither explain nor escape. A priest in Norfolk wrote, "The pestilence moved through the fields as if on the wind. One day a farm stood full of life. The next, only chickens wandered among the tools of the dead." When farming stopped, England's starved peasants were the backbone of medieval society. Without their labor, plowing, sowing, reaping, the entire feudal economy collapsed. When they began dying in great numbers, fields went and wheat rotted. Livestock wandered loose, unclaimed and uncared for. Many manorial lords recorded losses like entire families dead in a single week, villages abandoned entirely, sheep herds collapsing from lack of shepherds by 1350. Many rural estates had lost over half their workers. The manor system begins to break the medieval social order. Lords, villains, free tenants, serfs depended on rigid obligation. But death untied every bond. With so many peasants gone, surviving workers gained unexpected bargaining power. Some serfs fled their obligations entirely, seeking better wages in towns. Manorial courts, overwhelmed by the dead, could not stop them. A nobleman lamented, "The land is mine, yet none remain to work it." The serf now sets his own price. This shift would ignite economic and social revolutions in England for generations. A land of quiet ruins spoke of fields where the only sound was wind moving across empty cottages. Church bells ceased in villages where no one lived to ring them. The countryside, once England's refuge, had become a landscape of abandoned ploughs, empty doorways, and unburied dead. The plague had claimed the cities. Now it had conquered the land. Asterisk, in the medieval world, the church was the axis upon which life turned. From baptism to burial, every moment of existence was tied to ritual, prayer, and the belief that God guided all human fate. So when the Black Death swept across Europe, people instinctively turned to priests, monks, and bishops for protection, answers, and hope. Instead, they found silence, fear, and death. Clergy on the front lines at first. The clergy moved bravely among the sick. Priests administered last rites, monks tended to the dying, and nuns cared for abandoned children. But proximity made them the plague's earliest victims. Monasteries emptied. Convents fell silent. Churches lost entire staffs within weeks. In many towns, it was recorded, the priest himself died as he gave the sacraments. Without clergy, funerals ceased. Confessions were impossible. The spiritual life of entire communities collapsed overnight. The Church, struggles for answers. Medieval theology insisted the plague must be divine punishment. Sin, corruption, war, and greed, all were cited as reasons for God's wrath. Yet this explanation failed to satisfy the terrified masses, especially when the faithful died alongside the sinful, and holy places offered no protection. Some clergy urged massive public penance. Processions filled the streets, families walking barefoot, whipping themselves with iron-tipped cords, begging for forgiveness. These were the flagellants who marched from city to city, chanting solemn hymns and proclaiming, "Only through suffering shall God spare us." But in many cases, their gatherings only helped spread the disease faster. The waning authority of the Church, as the Church, failed to halt the catastrophe. Suspicion and anger spread. Why had God abandoned them? Why did prayers go unanswered? Why did even holy men die? People witnessed bishops fleeing cities, monasteries locked from within, and clerics refusing to bury the dead. Confidence in the Church's spiritual power began to crack. In some regions, despair replaced faith. In others, radical movements surged, mystics, apocalyptic prophets, and doomsayers claiming visions of the world's end. A German chronicler wrote, "The plague did not merely kill our bodies, it wounded our souls, the seeds of reformation known to those living through it." This crisis planted the first seeds of later upheaval's doubt, questioning new interpretations of faith, and the weakening of the Church's absolute authority. Europe's spiritual anchor had faltered, and in that void of trust and hope, darker forces began to rise. As the Black Death tore through towns and villages, fear and confusion overwhelmed reason. People grasped for explanations, for something or someone to blame. With doctors powerless and priests failing, medieval Europe turned to the most vulnerable, the scapegoats of society. Jews under fire. Jews, often living in segregated quarters and visible as traders or moneylenders, became targets of fury and superstition. Rumors spread that they had poisoned wells or cursed the Christian population. Entire communities were accused without evidence, condemned by mobs inflamed with fear. Chroniclers describe massacres in cities such as Strasbourg, Mainz, and Cologne. The Jews were dragged to the riverbanks. Houses were set ablaze. All that remained was ash and despair. In some regions, local authorities attempted to protect Jewish communities, but the tide of popular hysteria was unstoppable. Thousands were murdered, their property seized, and survivors driven into exile. These tragedies revealed the darkest aspects of human response to terror. Other scapegoats beyond the Jewish communities, anyone who deviated from social norms, beggars, lepers, wandering strangers could be accused. Witchcraft, heresy, and divine retribution became convenient explanations. In Italy, flagellant groups believed the plague was a punishment for sin, leading to violent confrontations with non-participants. Entire villages isolated suspected heretics, sometimes killing them to appease God. Mass hysteria and social breakdown fear also fractured family units. Accounts from England and France report parents abandoning sick children, siblings leaving each other to die, and friends refusing to aid neighbors. Town councils, overwhelmed, attempted curfews, barricades, and quarantines. Yet death slipped past all defenses. One chronicler noted, "Men became shadows of themselves." Neither piety nor wealth could shield them from the unseen enemy. The human toll beyond disease, the plague's destruction, was not solely biological. Psychological trauma, paranoia, and moral panic spread faster than the infection itself. Europe became a land of suspicion, mistrust, and chaos, where the law of God and man seemed suspended. In their desperate search for meaning, medieval Europeans created myths, legends, and scapegoats, some of which endure in historical memory. The Black Death did more than kill. It tore the social fabric, leaving communities fragmented, terrified, and forever changed. Asterisk, in the 14th century, medicine was a mixture of ancient theory, superstition, and ritual. Physicians relied on humoral theory, believing that health depended on the balance of blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. The Black Death shattered every assumption. Doctors and their limits physicians traveled from town to town, often arriving too late. Armed with herbal potions, poultices, and strange devices, they tried to treat the sick. Some wore beaked masks stuffed with aromatic herbs, hoping to filter miasma or poisonous air. Others applied leeches, bloodletting, or amulets. None worked. One physician wrote, "We applied all the arts known to man, yet the pestilence mocked us. Our prayers, potions, and knowledge failed." Hospitals, often run by monks or civic authorities, overflowed with patients. Beds were filled with fevered, delirious bodies. Caretakers risked their own lives, and many succumbed themselves. Entire wards became death traps. The surge of folk remedies, outside professional medicine, folk healers, wise women, and charlatans offered charms, prayers, and charms. Villagers burned fragrant herbs, drank concoctions of mercury or vinegar, or carried talismans inscribed with holy words. Superstition became both comfort and danger. Some practices spread disease further. Others offered psychological relief. Universities and scholarly debate medieval scholars debated feverishly. The University of Montpellier in France, a center for medical learning, held councils to determine whether the stars, corrupted air, or divine wrath caused the plague. Yet knowledge remained speculative. Even the most learned physicians could only watch. The epidemic exposed the fragility of medieval medicine. The limits of human understanding became painfully clear. Europe was facing a biological force beyond imagination. Doctors' moral dilemma for those who survived. The plague forced profound ethical choices. Should doctors treat the sick and risk death, or abandon their patients to survive? Many fled, leaving towns without medical care. Those who stayed were revered and feared. The thin line between healer and victim blurred. The legacy of medical failure, the Black Death, would transform medicine. Though medieval doctors could not stop the pestilence, their records, observations, and the desperate measures they tried laid the groundwork for future understanding of disease, contagion, and public health. In the darkness of the 14th century, doctors confronted an enemy they could neither see nor control, revealing the limits of reason in a world dominated by fear. Asterisk, by the height of the Black Death, Europe faced a demographic catastrophe unparalleled in its history. Estimates suggest that between 1347 and 1351, the plague claimed 25 to 50% of the continent's population, perhaps 75 million souls in total. Cities, towns, and countryside alike were depopulated, leaving a landscape of silence, ruins, and despair. Urban catastrophe major cities bore the brunt of the mortality. In Florence, chroniclers recorded nearly half the population perished. Paris and London lost between 1/3 and 2/3 of their inhabitants. Streets were empty. Markets were ghostly. The sound of church bells, tolling for the dead, echoed over deserted districts. Entire guilds disappeared. Trade slowed to a crawl. Civic structures collapsed under the sheer weight of mortality. Even the nobility suffered. Estates that had seemed invulnerable were abandoned as lords, and their households succumbed to the disease. Some families died out entirely, leaving lands without heirs. Feudal hierarchies wavered as death leveled distinctions between rich and poor, noble and peasant alike. Rural devastation, the countryside too, was transformed. Villages were abandoned, fields untilled, and pastures overrun by wandering livestock. Survivors often fled, seeking safer regions, spreading the disease further. In some regions, entire villages disappeared from the map, leaving only skeletal ruins and forgotten graves. Chroniclers described roads lined with corpses, not yet buried, and forests echoing with the cries of the bereaved social and economic. Shockwaves, the loss of labor, caused immediate economic disruption. Fields could not be harvested. Mills stood idle. Trade slowed to a trickle. Wages for survivors rose dramatically as labor became scarce. Yet scarcity of manpower also intensified social tensions. Lords tried to enforce old obligations, while peasants demanded higher compensation. This imbalance sowed seeds of peasant revolts and economic transformation in later decades. Psychological toll, the scale of mortality created pervasive fear and despair. Families were split. Communities that had survived famine or war fell apart under the relentless advance of death. Chroniclers repeatedly emphasized the feeling that the world itself was ending. The earth seemed cursed. Even the air we breathed brought despair and death. Europe had not merely suffered, it had been forever changed. The population collapse marked the beginning of social, economic, and spiritual transformations that would echo for centuries. The continent had been touched by a force beyond human control. And yet, amid the ruins, the seeds of recovery and of radical change quietly took root. The Black Death did not merely destroy, it shattered minds. Across Europe, fear became as deadly as the disease itself. When entire families perished in a matter of days, the living faced moral, emotional, and existential crises unlike anything seen before. Abandonment and isolation, many fled their homes in terror, leaving sick relatives behind. Parents abandoned children, siblings left one another, and servants fled manors. Chroniclers repeatedly described empty villages where the wind whispered through vacant homes. The living were haunted not only by the disease but by the guilt of survival. A monk in England wrote, "We wandered through streets where the dead lay unburied. None dared touch them. None dared mourn them. The living became ghosts among ghosts. Fear and moral panic in urban centers, rumors of poisoners, witches, and divine retribution spread faster than the plague itself. Communities turned inward, suspecting neighbors of secret plots to hasten death. Some fled to remote forests, while others barricaded themselves in fortified houses, only to discover that isolation did not guarantee safety. The rise of flagellants and extremes of faith fear drove some to extremes of religious devotion. Flagellant movements marched through towns, whipping themselves in public penance, believing that self-torture could appease God and halt the pestilence. Yet their gatherings, crowded and chaotic, often accelerated the spread of the disease at the same time. Apocalyptic prophets and mystics claimed visions of the end times. Art, literature, and sermons reflected a preoccupation with death, judgment, and the fragility of life. Mass, mourning, and public rituals end in despair. Communities sought rituals to cope. Mass graves became commonplace, and clergy, when available, performed hurried rites. Towns rang bells continuously, sometimes as warnings, sometimes as prayers. Music, theater, and storytelling took on darker, more somber tones, reflecting collective grief. The human spirit tested the psychological toll of the Black Death, revealed both the fragility and resilience of humanity. While fear led to abandonment, persecution, and hysteria, it also inspired acts of courage, compassion, and devotion. Nurses, priests, and neighbors risked infection to aid the dying. Some recorded their experiences, leaving a testimony for future generations. Europe's social and emotional landscape had shifted permanently. Communities would eventually recover numerically, but the mental scars of mass death lingered for decades, shaping the culture, art, and collective memory of the continent. The Black Death did more than kill. It upended the economic foundation of medieval Europe. With nearly half the population gone in some regions, labor became scarce, and the centuries-old feudal system, which depended on peasant servitude, began to crumble. A shortage of workers' fields, mills, and workshops stood empty. Lords demanded that remaining peasants maintain their duties, but with so few hands, work was impossible. In some villages, grain rotted in fields, and wool went unprocessed. Markets became erratic. Bread shortages and inflation followed. Scarcity of labor gave survivors unprecedented bargaining power. A chronicler observed, "No lord could command what remained." Peasants asked for wages unheard of before, and many fled to find better fortunes. Wage inflation and social tension. Wages for skilled and unskilled laborers rose dramatically. Workers recognized their value. Artisans and farmhands demanded payment for what had once been unpaid or minimally rewarded labor. Landowners attempted to enforce old contracts through proclamations, but enforcement was inconsistent. This tension fueled unrest. In England, King Edward III issued the Ordinance of Labourers in 1349, attempting to cap wages and restrict worker movement. Yet law could not fully control the economic shift. Surviving peasants increasingly challenged social hierarchies. Impact on trade and commerce. Urban centers faced similar upheaval. Trade slowed as merchants died or abandoned routes. Guilds lost members. Craft production declined. Prices for goods fluctuated wildly. Venice and Florence, heavily reliant on international trade, struggled to maintain supply chains. Some regions experienced near economic paralysis for years. Long-term transformations, the demographic collapse, forced European societies to adapt. Labor scarcity accelerated technological innovations. Watermills, windmills, and new farming techniques replaced some human labor. Landlords diversified crops and leased land differently, giving rise to tenant farming. Over decades, this restructuring contributed to the decline of rigid feudal obligations. The seed of social revolt to economic strain and newfound power of peasants planted the seeds for later social upheavals, including revolts such as the English Peasants' Revolt of 1381. Death had shifted the balance of power, subtly but irreversibly. The plague was not only a biological event, it reshaped labor, wealth, and social hierarchy, altering the economic landscape of Europe for generations to come. Asterisk, as Europe reeled from the devastation of the Black Death, the cultural landscape transformed, reflecting the trauma of mass mortality. Artists, writers, and thinkers grappled with the enormity of death, embedding its presence into literature, painting, and public consciousness. Literature as witness one of the most famous chroniclers, Giovanni Boccaccio, witnessed Florence's devastation firsthand. In the Decameron, he documented not only the sheer scale of death, but also human responses: fear, selfishness, compassion, and resilience. The narrative interwove storytelling with realism, capturing both the horror of plague and the enduring desire for life and joy amid despair. Similarly, chroniclers across England, France, and Germany recorded vivid accounts of empty streets, overflowing cemeteries, and social collapse. These works became primary sources for understanding the psychological impact of the plague. Art and the macabre visual arts reflected the omnipresence of death. Early examples of Dong's macabre dance of death emerged, depicting skeletons leading people of all social classes, peasants, nobles, clergy, toward their inevitable fate. Churches commissioned frescoes and carvings as reminders of mortality and the transient nature of life. Art became a tool for meditation, morality, and public reflection. Music and ritual, the collective mourning, also influenced music. Gregorian chants, lamentations, and dirges echoed through cities emptied of joy. Processions, often led by flagellants, combined ritual, music, and penance in attempts to appease God or find solace. Religion reimagined, the church remained central. Yet the plague forced adaptations in worship. Devotional practices became more personal and introspective. Reliance on saints and relics increased, while apocalyptic sermons and imagery became common. Communities sought meaning amid suffering, leading to a rich tapestry of faith, superstition, and artistic expression, a new perspective on life and death. Cultural production during and after the Black Death reflects a Europe grappling with mortality on an unprecedented scale. Literature, art, and music became vessels for collective grief, moral reflection, and psychological survival. In the shadow of devastation, creativity flourished as a testament to human resilience. The plague did not erase European culture, it reshaped it. In mourning, Europe discovered new forms of expression, and in those expressions, the memory of the dead endured. Asterisk. While Europe reeled under the Black Death, the disease was not confined to the continent. Its origins lay in the steppes of Central Asia, and trade networks carried it across vast regions, affecting the Middle East, North Africa, and even China. The interconnected world of the 14th century allowed contagion to move faster than armies or merchants ever could. The Silk Road, as a vector, caravans traveling the Silk Road carried more than silk, spices, and ideas. They carried rats and fleas, invisible agents of death. Cities like Karakoram, Samarkand, and Kaffa suffered early outbreaks, decimating populations and forcing trade networks to collapse. The plague traveled along trade hubs, stopping only briefly before leaping onward to distant cities. The Middle East under Sijin, the Middle Eastern regions of Persia, Iraq, and Egypt. The plague struck urban centers with devastating precision. Cairo, one of the largest cities in the world, saw high mortality in crowded neighborhoods. Ports such as Alexandria became conduits to Mediterranean Europe. The Mamluk Sultanate recorded significant losses, impacting military and administrative structures. Scholars and chroniclers documented the scale of suffering, noting empty streets, abandoned markets, and overflowing cemeteries. China and Central Asian China, where the pandemic likely began, cities and villages were emptied of life. Trade disruption led to famine, compounding the plague's effect. Historians estimate that tens of millions perished across the Mongol territories. Population losses in these regions would take centuries to recover. Similar to Europe, trade, travel, and global connectivity, the spread of the Black Death highlights the medieval world's interconnectedness. Economic and cultural exchanges, long praised for fostering prosperity, became vectors of disaster. What began as a regional epidemic in Central Asia became a pandemic on an unprecedented scale, reshaping societies across continents. Consequences beyond Europe. Though European experience dominates historical memory, the Black Death transformed global trade, weakened states, and altered social hierarchies in the Middle East and Asia. These regions faced famine, political instability, and shifts in economic power, a silent ripple effect from the same invisible enemy that swept Europe. The Black Death was not merely a European tragedy. It was a worldwide cataclysm, reminding humanity of the vulnerability inherent in global interconnection. By the mid-1350s, the first waves of the Black Death had passed across Europe. Cities, towns, and villages were scarred, but life slowly resumed. Yet the continent that emerged was forever transformed demographically, socially, and economically. Population recovery estimates suggest that Europe lost 1/3 to 1/2 of its population. Some regions, like Florence or London, lost more than 60%. Over the following decades, populations began a slow recovery. But the pre-plague levels of growth would not return for over a century. Entire settlements were abandoned permanently. Some villages vanished, leaving empty fields and skeletal ruins behind. Labor, shortages, and social mobility. The most immediate consequence was a shortage of labor. Survivors found that wages rose, living standards improved, and mobility increased. Serfs and peasants could demand better treatment or relocate to find work. Landlords, desperate to cultivate their lands, offered incentives or more favorable terms. The medieval feudal system, once rigid, began to crumble under this demographic pressure. Urban centers, rebuilt cities, though devastated, were slowly Merchants returned to trade, and artisans rebuilt workshops. Markets reopened. Public infrastructure, such as bridges and roads, was repaired with newfound labor availability. The economic boom of the late 14th century, in part, can be traced to the scarcity-driven rise in wages and opportunities for skilled workers, shifts in agriculture and land use with fewer workers available. Large-scale grain cultivation declined in some areas, replaced by pasture, sheep farming, and more manageable crops. Estates diversified production and increasingly leased land to tenants rather than relying on forced labor. These shifts permanently altered the rural economy and landscape. Psychological and cultural recovery. Society also recovered psychologically. Religious practices evolved. While some retained fear-driven rituals, others embraced more personal faith expressions. Art and literature shifted, reflecting both the trauma of the plague and humanity's resilience. The Danse Macabre, literature like the Decameron, and apocalyptic imagery influenced culture for generations. The legacy of the Black Death's aftermath was not simply death. It was transformation, population collapse, spurred social mobility, economic innovation, and cultural adaptation. The medieval world had been broken, but in its ruins, Europe began a slow ascent into a new era, shaped by the lessons of mortality, labor, and resilience. The first wave of the Black Death did not end Europe's nightmare. From 1351 onward, the plague returned in periodic outbreaks over the next century. Cities, villages, and trade routes became familiar stages for recurring death. Survivors lived with the constant fear that the disease could strike again at any time. Second and third waves, historical records indicate that outbreaks occurred roughly every 10 to 15 years. Some were local, others spread widely across countries. For instance, England suffered waves in 1361 to 1362 and later in 1374, 1390, and 1400. France, Italy, and Spain experienced similar cycles. Each recurrence brought death, social disruption, and economic pressure. Impact on society even in smaller waves. Mortality could be devastating. Communities that had begun rebuilding were forced to restart. Funerals once more overflowed. Fields went untended, and artisans faced shortages of apprentices. Mental trauma accumulated. The memory of the first wave's horror lingered, and a culture of fatalism and fear shaped behavior. People became wary of strangers, avoided crowded places, and adjusted rituals to cope with repeated mortality. Adaptation and public health. Measures recurring plague waves prompted early public health interventions. Cities experimented with quarantine measures, especially in port towns like Venice and Marseille. Arriving ships were isolated. Travelers were inspected. Infected households were confined. The term quarantine itself emerged from this period, derived from the Italian 40 giorni, or 40 days of isolation. While primitive by modern standards, these measures slowed transmission and influenced future public health strategies. The psychological toll repeated waves deepened despair. Communities that had already lost much felt abandoned by God, rulers, and fate itself. Folk remedies, religious penances, and superstitions persisted, while the fear of contagion became ingrained in European consciousness. Children born after the first wave grew up in a world where death was omnipresent, shaping attitudes toward life, faith, and society. Long-term consequences, the recurring Black Death waves prevented Europe from returning to its pre-plague demographic and economic equilibrium. They reinforced labor scarcity, drove social and technological innovation, and maintained a culture of vigilance and caution that would echo through the Renaissance. The plague had become a recurring shadow, a grim companion to medieval life, shaping not only the present, but the trajectory of centuries to come. The Black Death did not occur in isolation. It unfolded against the backdrop of ongoing conflicts, most notably the 100 Years' War between England and France. These wars, combined with the plague, amplified social, economic, and political chaos across Europe. Armies as vectors. Medieval armies were concentrated hubs of disease. Soldiers marched along trade routes, crowded into encampments, and lived in poor sanitary conditions. Fleas and rats thrived in tents, granaries, and carts. Plague spread quickly through these mobile populations, sometimes decimating entire regiments before they engaged in battle. During campaigns in northern France, chroniclers noted, men fell not from swords, but from the unseen hand of death. Commanders faced impossible decisions: fight the enemy or flee from contagion. Armies were often delayed, dispersed, or annihilated by illness rather than combat. Sieges and plague cities under siege became particularly vulnerable. The stress of starvation, overcrowding, and poor hygiene intensified infection. For instance, the siege of Kaffa in 1346, one of the earliest recorded uses of biological tactics, demonstrated how plague could interact with warfare. Though the events occurred earlier, the principle endured. Armies inadvertently transported disease across regions. Political consequences. The plague weakened states already strained by war. Monarchs lost soldiers, nobles, and administrators. Revenues declined as taxes could not be collected from depopulated towns and farms. In England, Edward III struggled to maintain military campaigns in France while managing labor shortages at home. France faced similar crises, with armies depleted and peasants revolting against feudal demands intensified by economic pressure. Social upheaval. The combination of war and plague magnified social unrest. Labor, scarcity, famine, and mortality fueled resentment toward ruling elites. Towns and villages, weakened by repeated waves of disease, struggled to defend themselves or contribute to war efforts. Social cohesion frayed, and opportunistic nobles and bandits exploited the chaos. Legacy of conflict and contagion. The intertwining of warfare and plague reshaped European politics. Strategic decisions were influenced not only by military calculations, but also by the fear of contagion. Some historians argue that the Black Death indirectly shortened campaigns, shifted battle outcomes, and contributed to long-term transformations in feudal power structures. Death marched across Europe in two forms: swords and disease, leaving a continent forever altered by both. Asterisk, the Black Death did not merely kill. It restructured European society. With so much of the population lost, survivors found themselves in a position of unprecedented power. Peasants, laborers, and artisans could demand higher wages, negotiate leases, or escape oppressive obligations. Europe's rigid feudal hierarchy began to fracture, sowing the seeds of social revolution. Labor, mobility, and peasant. Leverage landowners faced a dire choice: accept higher wages or leave fields untilled. In England, rural workers moved freely from estate to estate, demanding payment for labor that once bound them to the soil. Chroniclers recorded lords pleading with surviving peasants, "Work our lands, or all shall lie fallow." The scarcity of laborers meant that serfs were no longer powerless. They could resist oppressive demands, challenge unjust treatment, or leave entirely. A profound shift from centuries of feudal dominance. Revolt and resistance. Economic pressures and social change sparked unrest. The English Peasants' Revolt of 1381, though decades later, can trace its origins to the Black Death. Heavy taxation, combined with labor shortages and increased bargaining power, created fertile ground for rebellion. Across Europe, smaller uprisings and disputes between peasants and nobility reflected the new social dynamics. Transformation of urban life. Cities, depopulated yet vital, also experienced transformation. Guilds, workshops, and markets reorganized. Skilled artisans could demand higher wages or relocate to cities offering better prospects. Urban governance adapted, with councils gaining power as surviving citizens reshaped economic and political structures. Cultural shifts. Experience of mass mortality influenced worldviews. Survivors became more aware of life's fragility, fostering a culture of pragmatism alongside piety. Art, literature, and religious practice increasingly reflected individual experience, mortality, and moral introspection. The medieval mindset began to evolve, paving the way for humanism and the Renaissance. Long-term consequences, the Black Death, accelerated trends that would otherwise have taken centuries. It challenged feudal authority, expanded labor rights, and redefined economic and social relationships. Europe emerged with new hierarchies, new expectations, and a profound awareness of mortality. While the plague destroyed millions, it also reshaped the continent's political, economic, and cultural future. The shadow of death gave birth to a new world, one that remembered the cost of life, the value of labor, and the fleeting nature of human power.